Good day and good morning, everyone, and welcome to our new topic on our UTS course, which is entitled What Philosophy Says About the Self. In this section, we will be learning about the different philosophers who offer different perspectives on just about any topic relating to the self. Philosophically, the discussion on the self is just like a basic search for meaning and one's purpose in life. Because in philosophy, one's inability to define oneself leads to a lot of contradictions within the self later on. And the philosophers are trying to let us learn and remind us that one of the many imperatives in life is to know ourselves and to go on with the business of leading a life charted by oneself. Meaning, every day is an opportunity for us to grow, to discover something about ourselves, to know deeper about our being, and to also help us improve and be a better versions of ourselves each day. So let's begin. Philosophy is considered to be the mother of all disciplines, since all of the fields of study began as philosophical discourses. And philosophy regarded the self as a unified being. They are essentially connected to our consciousness, awareness, and agency, or in other words, one's rationality or one's ability to also understand the world and make a sound choice or decision. So, one of the most famous thinkers of his time is Socrates. He offered to us the principle know yourself or know thyself, which tells every man to bring his inner self to light. Or, in other words, it is simply about self knowledge. Socrates posited that if a person knows who he is or who she is, all basic issues and difficulties in life will vanish and everything will be clearer and simpler. Because one could now act according to his or her own definition of the self without any doubt and contradictions. And that's why he became famous of his Socratic method, where he would often question things, and as one keep on asking questions, they would basically be closer and discover about the truth. Now, Socrates emphasized so much about knowing oneself because he believed that self knowledge is knowing one's degree of understanding about the world and knowing one's capabilities and potentials. So it is only through self knowledge that one's self emerges. So Socrates reminds us that we should know ourselves pretty well. What are our triggers? What are the things that we don't like? What are the things that we need to discover more about ourselves? And how do we find purpose? And what is our purpose? And what is our existence all about? And in Socrates' philosophy, we would be able to also understand that the self is achieved and not just discovered. It is something to work on and not a product of a mere realization. It is not just a mere enlightenment, but it's a constant process to also achieve oneself by knowing more about ourselves. Because a person who doesn't know oneself would also turn out to become confused and would later turn out to be a bad man. And according to Socrates, a bad man is not virtuous because He doesn't know himself or herself, and that leads to ignorance. And ignorance about oneself is a vice, meaning people continue to do bad things because they don't know and they poorly know about themselves. So Socrates tried to argue that a person's acceptance of ignorance is a springboard for the acquisition of knowledge later on. So he emphasized that one must first have the humility to acknowledge his or her ignorance so as to acquire self-knowledge. On the contrary, Socrates believed that the man who does not follow the good fails to do so because he does not recognize it. And it leads us to the understanding that the core of the Socratic ethics is the concept of virtue and knowledge. Socrates was also a dualist. He believed that man, aside from having a body, man also has a soul, and these two entities are dependent of each other. The body serves as the form to where the soul would be housed, and the soul gives the body, or what makes the body alive. And the only time that the soul is released out from the body is through death. But it is only the body would come to an end, since he regarded the human soul as immortal. For Socrates, virtue is the deepest and the most basic propensity of man. He regarded knowledge as a virtue, and a virtue is innate in the mind of self-knowledge, meaning it is the source of all wisdom. An individual may gain possession of oneself and be one's own master through self-knowledge, meaning we have all the potential to acquire knowledge only if we are also humble enough, according to Socrates, to accept that we are ignorant about oneself, and by that acceptance alone we are able to also gain self-knowledge, because that's the beginning of everything. To have an open mind, to understand that not all the knowledge could be acquired, but the openness to discover oneself is a key towards knowing more about oneself. Now, a student of Socrates is Plato, and he presented to us the ideal self and the perfect self. So Plato's conceptualization of the self was profoundly introduced in his dialogue called the Phaedrus. So the main idea of his dialogue was that the truth can be distinguished in two forms. One is the metaphysical realm, or something that can't be touched, cannot be easily perceived, but it is there. And the other form is the physical world, which includes the body. He suggested that the self is fundamentally an intellectual entity whose nature exists independent from the physical world. So Plato is trying to emphasize that the self is more than just the embodiment of our physical body, but it is something that exists independently from the physical world, an intelligent one. Further, Plato um, bifurcated the reality into two, which um, he identified ontos, or the ideal, as the ultimate reality, which is permanent and spiritual. So, ontos is where the ideal self is present and it's permanent and in a spiritual form, while the phenomena is the manifestation of the ideal. So, in other words, it is the body or the embodiment of the ideal self is the phenomena, and that is how we experience the real world, a manifestation of the ideal. Plato also believed that man was omniscient or all-knowing before he came to be born into this world. But with his separation from the paradise of truth and knowledge and his long exile on earth, which is again the embodiment in our physical body here on earth, we forgot most of the knowledge that we acquired. However, by constant remembering through contemplation and doing good, we can regain our former imperfections. So it is like it was conceptualized that back then we used to have a perfect self. But because of our exile in our own embodiment here in this world, we have forgotten about the truth and the knowledge that we previously acquired and learned. But as long as we continue to do good, then we can regain our imperfections. Plato also believed that man, who is now an exile on earth, has a guiding star, like a model or a divine exemplar, which he must follow to reach and attain his destiny. By giving us this concept of a guiding star or a model, it means that there is that ideal self which a person tries to emulate to attain his or her destiny. And further, Plato believed that happiness, which is the fruit of virtue, is attained by the constant imitation of the divine exemplar of virtue. So if we continue to follow and to perform what is right and emulate a model, a perfect self or an ideal self, it may lead us to the formulation or redeeming our perfect and previous self. Aristotle suggested that the ideal is subsumed into the phenomena. So he just made a follow-up with Plato's conceptualization of the ideal and the phenomena. He called the ideal as essence, so the metaphysical realm, and the phenomena as the matter. He also emphasized that the two coexist and are codependent. The essence provides meaning and the purpose to the matter, and in return, the matter provides substance and solidity to the essence, which totally makes sense. Because the ideal or the essence is like giving us a certain direction, it navigates us into that direction to where the matter would also go. So it provides this, or the matter provides the substance for the realization of the essence as an attainable goal in life. Now, Aristotle is considered as an empiricist because he thinks that all knowledge comes to human beings from and through sensation. So our mind starts as a blank slate, and from sensation, we get our ideas or the so-called contents of our minds. So it is through exploration that we begin to understand the world around us. So it is not actually what others believe that we already have self-knowledge, but in empiricism, it is through experience, through sensation, through making sense of the world, connecting the dots And it is through that where we could be able to find a bigger picture of how the world is and how the world looks like. So as you can see, it was Aristotle who started empiricism, and we would lead now the discussion to classical antiquity, and we would understand that the philosophy of the self has been defined through two distinct lenses, meaning how people viewed philosophy um, could also be divided into two. One is empiricism, as mentioned earlier. There is no such thing as innate knowledge, but instead, knowledge is derived from the experience, either perceived with the five senses or processed within our brains. On the other hand, we also have rationalism, which believes that there is that innate knowledge within us. However, there are different sources of innate knowledge. So, Immanuel Kant is another philosopher who believed that man is the only creature who governs and directs himself and his actions, who sets up an end for himself and his purpose, and who freely orders means for the attainment of his aims. So Immanuel Kant tried to emphasize that it is us who are the ones in control of ourselves, who set sails for ourselves, and who decides to also put an end if ever individuals have given up, or it is also our own will to continue with life despite of the challenges. And he believed that every man is thus an end in himself and should never be treated merely as a means. So meaning you should not be objectifying other people, use them to come to an end or to achieve something. His plain dictum of reason and justice is to respect others as you would respect yourself. So, respect begets respect, according to Immanuel Kant. And a person should not be used as a tool, an instrument, or any device to accomplish another's private ends. So, this is also a sad reality described by Immanuel Kant that many people who have skills and talents who could be the catalyst for change in the world, but sad to say they are being utilized by others for their own personal whims and desires in this life. But then again, um, as individuals, we hope that we would gain respect others in the way we also respect them. So it is just a reciprocal kind of respect. If you respect others, then they would you would also earn the kind of respect that you would wish to also experience from them. Rene Descartes, another philosopher and thinker, and a popular one during his time, and he stated that the self is a thinking entity, which is separate and distinct from the body. He was famous with his principle cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. Although the mind and the body are independent from each other and they serve their own function, man must use his own mind and thinking abilities to investigate, analyze, experiment, and develop himself. Now, this conceptualization of Rene Descartes back in the days, if you try to analyze it in the recent time, there is already that negation against this philosophy. Even in the field of psychology and medicine, it is now accepted that the body-mind dualism is a considered fact. Like in the field of psychology, Whatever it is, as considered to be a problem in the mind, is also a considerable problem in the body, and vice versa. The same in the medical field. So, mental health is not just a concern in a person's head, but the rest of the body is also being affected by such condition. So notice that if you try to understand mental health or a particular mental disorder, even if there are signs and symptoms, it is also inevitable that you could observe some bodily signs and symptoms, even if they say that it's a mental health problem. So it is not just a mere problem of the brain, but since the brain is connected to the body, so any condition relating to mental health is also considered a problem with our physical body. Another philosopher is John Locke, and he emphasized about personal identity. Locke holds that personal identity or the self is a matter of psychological continuity. Personal identity is founded in one's consciousness or memory and not on the substance of either the soul or the body. So Locke tried to understand that our own self identity lies in our own consciousness, and our identity is the concept about ourselves that evolves over the course of our life. He supports that consciousness can be transferred from one substance. It could either be a body and a soul to another. While the soul is changed, for instance, consciousness remains, thereby maintaining the personal identity through the change. John Locke tried to philosophize that it is possible that our souls could be changed, but our consciousness would still remain the same. But if in the case that our consciousness could be changed, could be involuntarily changed through forgetfulness, then it might actually be a different person when consciousness is already changed or different. Now, another remarkable contribution of John Locke is the notion of the tabula rasa. It is the concept that posits that everyone started as a blank slate, and the content is provided by one's experiences over time. Another philosopher is David Hume, and he believed that the self is the bundle theory of mind. Hume is skeptical about the existence of the self, specifically on whether there is a simple, a unified self that exists over time. For him, man has no clear and intelligible idea of the self. He posits that no single impression of the self exists. Rather, the self is just the thing to which all perceptions of a man is ascribed. So even if there were such an impression of the self, it should remain constant over time to constitute identity. However, man's impressions vary and always change. So in other words, Hume did not believe about the existence of the soul because it is a mental entity, and a mental entity is not a substance that could exist. And he views that the soul is just a product of imagination, and any concept of the self is simply memory and imagination. Again, Hume did not also agree with the existence of the self because what we have is just an impression, a set, a bundle of theories, assumptions, perceptions about who we are. So when someone describes you that you are a happy person, if you are hungry, if you are sad, cold, you are it at this very moment, which constitute to the self. But if you are to find and looking for the self, you cannot actually find it. What one can find is that it is a set of individual impressions, and that is what you are, and that is who you are according to other people's impressions and perceptions about you. So this is just a very simple philosophy, believing that you are what you are as of the moment, as what other people perceive and see you as who you are. So Hume believed that a person can never observe oneself without some other perceptions. So you need to also hear other people's perceptions about you to know about oneself. And Hume asserts what we call as the self is really just a bundle of or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity, meaning in just one single moment you could actually describe a person in many different forms with how we perceive him or her. In the Christian or biblical view of the self, it is believed in Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 to 28. It says that God created man in his image, and in the divine image he created him, male and female he created them. God blessed them, saying, "Be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds in the air, and all the living things that move on earth." So this is also what the Christian or the biblical view of the self posits on how it views the self. So long as we follow and believe in a certain form of faith or religion, we actually embrace this kind of view, not just to the extent that people would take it literally, because there's also a point in my practice that there was this one client of mine who literally tried to understand this phrase, God created man in his image. So that person suffered from um, a schizotypal personality, wherein he believed literally that he was created in God's image, that he began to also look like Jesus Christ. So he grew his beard, he also grew his hair, and also dressed like Jesus Christ. And he was actually about to offer his son through a sacrifice in his own cult. But luckily, the wife was able to discover his plans. That the wife decided right away to also file for an annulment case against her husband. So again, we have various philosophies. We have understood some of them. Some of them are also very deep to understand, but let's remember that these are philosophies, these are assumptions, these are just guides on how we could be able to live a productive life, a fruitful life. But things like these messages could not be taken so literally somehow. So, according to the Holy Writ, man, following his redemption by the Savior from eternal bondage, now shares in the infinite merits of his Redeemer and has become not only the inheritor of the new earth but also the heir of heavenly kingdom. And thus, it is appropriate to think of the self as a multi-bejeweled crown of creation, the many gems thereof representing and radiating the glorious facets of man's self that include the physical, intellectual, moral, religious, social, political, economic, emotional, sentient, aesthetic, sensual, and sexual aspects. Now, another philosopher, who is Saint Augustine, believes that a virtuous life is a dynamism of love. So it is a constant following of and turning towards love, while a wicked life is a constant turning away from life. So if you wanna live a virtuous life, then we need to follow the dynamism of love, because if we are turning away from life, then we are also living a bad and a wicked life. According to St. Augustine, loving God means loving one's fellow men, and loving one's fellow men denotes never doing any harm to another, or as the golden principle of justice states, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. So no matter how underprivileged or privileged we are in our lives right now, it shouldn't actually push us to hurt, neglect, or even ignore other people's rights. We should actually be able to also share what we have and be able to also help them with their day-to-day struggles if possible. No matter how successful or unsuccessful we are in our lives, it shouldn't be that we would conclude other people's plight or misery. Instead, we should choose to also show love, respect, and many other virtues in order for them to also feel inspired, like moving forward through inspiring other people with our story if we are successful. And if we are not yet in that kind of level of success in our lives, then one way is to also be motivated how people were able to also rise up from all those challenges in their lives. Now, another philosopher in the person of Gilbert Ryle um, tried to also contend Rene Descartes' I think therefore I am, wherein he was able to also postulate his own phrase saying I act therefore I am. Ryle maintained that the mind is not a separate entity from the body, and the mind consists of dispositions of people based on what they know, what they feel, what they want, and so on. And people learn that they have their own minds because they behave in certain ways. And what he emphasized is his principle or a theory called analytical behaviorism, which is a theory of the mind which states that mental concepts can be understood through observable events. So whatever it is that the mind could conceive, could think of, there is that presence of evidence through people's actions, and these are what he meant with observable events, which eventually led him to also conclude that when a person would behave or act, then since there is no separation of the mind and the body, and they are considered to be together, then when you act, therefore, the mind and the body are present. They are tuned as one. They are in a rhythm. They are in a synchronicity process. that Gilbert Ryle was able to conceptualize and able to put it, that when a person acts, then there is also that presence of that physical manifestation of behavior, as well as the metaphysical representation of the mind. Another set of philosophers are the couple, or is the couple Paul and Patricia Churchland. They introduced eliminative materialism, which is a radical claim that ordinary or common sense understanding of the mind is deeply wrong, and that some or all of the mental states posited by common sense do not actually exist. So for them, self is nothing else but brain, or simply the self is contained entirely within the physical brain. So what they try to emphasize here is the idea: to understand the self, one must be able to study the brain and not just the mind. So this couple tries to let us know that if you want to know more about the self, then study the brain, its chemistry, the different parts of the brain. So we need to identify what are the functions of our uh, lobes in the brain. Now you would understand that the frontal lobe is where one could be able to understand, and that is the seat of one's rationality. And also, what is the function of amygdala? The amygdala is basically the area where it is identified to where emotions are, especially fear. That is always the activated area whenever one is afraid. And many different parts of the brain, like our neurotransmitters, which are responsible for our mood. Some of these neurotransmitters are even identified as the culprits of depression, bipolar disorder, and many other mood disorders. We also have Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He is a French phenomenological philosopher who distinguished the body into two types. One is the subjective body, as the lived and experienced, and the other is the objective body, as the observed and scientifically investigated. Maurice Merleau identified or regarded the self as the embodied subjectivity, meaning it sees human beings neither as a disembodied mind nor as a complex machine, but as living creatures whose subjectivity or consciousness is actualized in the forms of their physical involvement in the world. So Maurice Merleau-Ponty tried to show to us that there is that subjective embodiment based on the person's experience, and we also have that object body or embodiment through which we could observe and scientifically investigate, which basically like or reminds us with how we could be able to understand individuals' behavior through their subjective experience and also bodily manifestations and behavioral patterns as we try to investigate the person's behavior. Furthermore, he opposed the Cartesian cogito. For him, consciousness is both perceiving and engaging. He accepts the idea of mental states, but he also suggests that the use of the mind is inseparable from our bodily situated physical nature. So you cannot just divide the mind from the body. According to him, the body cannot be viewed solely as an object or material entity of the world. So what it tries to imply to us that if we have To study about the person's or an individual's so-called self, or the conceptualization of the self, we need to look into the subjective embodiment. We need to look into the person's subjective experience and also with the objective manifestations of behavior.